Good morning, everybody. We are very pleased and very honored to have with us this morning Professor Verónica Rodríguez-Blanco, from the University of Surrey in England. I thank her very much for having accepted our invitation to share her ideas on the common good with us this morning and this week, actually. So thank you very much. To start, I would have to, following protocol, make a short presentation of Professor Veronica. She got her degree in law, bachelor's degree in law, if I'm not mistaken, in Caracas at the Catholic University of Caracas. And then she followed her studies in England. First in Oxford, Balliol College, for her master's degree, and then for her PhD in Cambridge, Corpus Christi College. She has been working on, basically, if I'm not mistaken, practical reason in law, practical reason and ethics in law. She teaches basically philosophy, jurisprudence of law, at the University of Surrey, and she's interested both in law, as we would say, a dogmatic science. She studies torts and private law, but she connects that with her ethical research and her research on practical reason. This morning, or this week actually, she's going to discuss with us an ongoing project, I believe, on the common good, maybe the common goods also, we could say. And this is part of her present research. I am sure we will all enjoy her lectures, the conversation, especially on the subject, which is of great importance for all of us here who are present here this morning and also throughout the week. So without any further ado, I thank Professor Veronica, and then of course I have to, to thank also Professor Barzotto, who's a friend, dear friend and colleague who has been with us several times here at the University of São Paulo, where he got his PhD degree. And he's also interested in all these subjects we're going to discuss, which is practical reason, justice, common good, republicanism. He's been doing research on the subject. So I thank you very much once again for taking all the trouble to come to São Paulo and stay with us for these next few days. So thanks a lot, Barzotto. You're a friend, you have been in the house. You got your PhD here with us. So thanks a lot once again. And I would like to thank also the young scholars who are here, who have prepared this meeting for us, this seminar. Martin, Daniel, Gilberto, who were ahead of all the preparation and organization of this week. Thank you very much. Thank everybody. Thanks, Professor Veronica. Welcome. You may take the floor.
Okay, perfect. Okay, lovely. You all can hear me, right? Yeah, so it is really a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Reinaldo de Lima Lopez, for this kind introduction. So yes, it is a privilege and a pleasure to deliver this series of lectures. I would like especially to thank Professor Reinaldo de Lima Lopez for making this possible. I'm deeply grateful to the University of Sao Paulo for the generous support, and also a special thanks to Professor Luis Barzotto and to Professor Carlos Daniel Murata, Carlos Federico Jesus, and Gilberto Moebach, who all have kindly accepted to commend these lectures. So we will have the lectures on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and I really look forward to open the conversation. I will talk a little bit about what this project is about. I cannot imagine a better place and a more stimulating intellectual environment to engage with the idea of the political and legal common good than Brazil. Originally, coming from Venezuela, I understand that the concept of a general common good within the framework of political and legal institutions often elicits concerns. Being brought up in Latin America makes me aware that our common history of tyranny and dictatorship has made us skeptical of ideas such as the common good of the political and legal community. However, it seems to me that the question of the legal and political common good is inexorable for us. And this is what I would like to argue in this lecture series. I will not elaborate on a positive conclusion, but rather explore the limits of the idea of the common good within legal and political communities. I'm also conscious that this is a challenging and difficult task, and hence, as Socrates taught us, we need to do this together, philosophizing and asking uncomfortable questions. So this is a series of lectures that I will deliver during this week, and it's part of a larger project on understanding what the common good is not, and also trying to rethink the common good in relation to the concept of freedom. So it's a 2-volume task. I have already a contract with CUP to deliver the book for next year. And this is really, as you well pointed out, Reynaldo, is very much a work in progress. So I really, really look forward to your comments on this part. And then there is a second part which deals with the question of internal and external freedom, and also negative and positive freedom in relation to the common good. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the question of the limits of the conception of the common good. Introduction, background on the problem of the common good and the creation of social institutions. So political philosophers in the analytical philosophical tradition are typically skeptical of the notion of the good as primary and inexorable. They oppose the notion that goodness is inherent to our nature as beings. Any teleological perspective about human beings characterized by direction and constitution through goodness seems implausible. Communitarians contend that end as good are integral to who we are, seeking to subvert liberalism. Consequently, communitarians assert that there is no detached or neutral realm in which we suspend the concept of the good while addressing freedom and justice, as this would involve both A, an inaccurate portrayal of our practical reasoning, and B, the establishment of social institutions that are incongruent with our human nature. Liberalism and political liberalism premise their views on the detachment between right and good. This is a well-trodden path, and in the last 50 years, the dispute between liberalism in all its versions and perfectionism or communitarianism generated important and insightful literature that has significant implications for the key questions about the role of the state in the citizens' good and common good. However, in the late 1950s, a significant dispute arose among moral philosophers regarding the idea of good as a non-natural and intrinsic property. Peter Gage reignited the discussion with his paper, Good and Evil, in which he criticizes G. Moore's defense of the idea of the good simpliciter as an indefinable and non-natural property, which he proposed in his seminal book, Principia Ethica. Moore makes the most compelling case of the good as out there and real. Moore, using Plato's idea of the form, argues that the position of the rational egoist is self-contradictory, showing that to assert that, quote, X is my own good, end of the quote, or X is good for me, is not different in meaning from the assertion X is good. Moore states his points as follows, quote, what then is meant by my own good? In what sense can a thing be a good for me? It is obvious, if we reflect, that the only thing which can belong to me, which can be mine, is something which is good and not the fact that it is good. When therefore I talk of anything I get as my own good, I must mean either that the thing I get is good or that my possessing it is good. In both cases, it is only the thing or the possession of it which is mine and not the goodness of that thing or that possession. There is no longer any meaning in attaching the mine to our predicate and saying, the possession of this by me is by good. The same still holds, for what I think is that my possession of it is good simply. And if I think rightly, then the truth is that my possession of it is good simply, not in any sense my good, and I think wrongly it is not good at all, end of the quote. So imagine that I say, this horse is mine, or this is a horse of mine. My ownership of the horse means I can ride, feed, care for, name, and enjoy it. However, there's no denying that this, which is mine, is indeed a horse. The claim this horse is mine does not imply exclusive ownership of horseness, or that the properties that characterize a horse are exclusively mine. Similarly, when I say that this is good for me, it merely means that it is something that is good and that I participate in it. It cannot mean that I possess it and no one else. This would be absurd, as it would imply that goodness is a fact or item that anyone can possess. Moore's insight illuminates a premise that I believe is missing in a debate on the connections between the citizen's good, defined as this is good for her or him, the concept of the common good, and the state's ultimate role as a mere instrument of the good. So let me explain. A common interpretation of John Finnis's view is that his conception of the common good is instrumental. He seems to endorse this view in several passages of natural law, natural rights. For example, he states that the common good is, quote, a set of conditions which enables the members of the community to attain for themselves reasonable objections and or to realize reasonably for themselves the values for the sake of which they have reason to collaborate with each other positively and or negatively in a community. Finnis calls this merely instrumental way of understanding the common good, the third sense of the common good. However, he also adds that this third sense cannot be understood without understanding the common good in the first sense. This first sense is characterized by the common good for human beings as much as the basic goods are good for any and every person. There is also a second sense, which he characterizes as follows, quote, and each of these human values is itself a common good, inasmuch as it can be participated in by an inexhaustible number of persons in an exhaustible variety of goods or an exhaustible variety of occasions. Finnis asserts that there exist explanatory levels and significant relationships between the common good and also known as the public interest or the third sense of the concept, and the basic goods in the first and second sense. He goes on to say, quote, "These two senses of the common good are to be distinguished from a third, from which, however, they are not radically different." This is puzzling. If the common good is merely instrumental, then the state's role is to create the conditions for the basic goods cultivated by citizens. How are A, the ground level of the plurality of goods, the participation of any and every person, the first sense, and how we attain or participate in them, participation in a variety of ways and occasions, second sense, related to C, common sense as merely instrumental, the third sense? Arguably, the law only plays the role of ensuring that the conditions for the participation of the basic goods are present without engaging with the nature and character of the plurality of the basic goods. However, this will make his passage on the explanatory levels between common good and basic goods mysterious. In his response to Murphy's criticism of Finney's view on the common good as merely instrumental and redundant in relation to the perfection of the individuals in the political community, George Duke clearly defends the view that common good as instrumental is not superfluous. George puts this as follows, quote, "It is important to note implicitly that there is no reason in principle to assert that a state of affairs or normative objective must be redundant simply because it serves a more ultimate end." End of the quote. The fact that the common good serves the basic goods does not imply that it is superfluous or redundant. I will elaborate on this concept, albeit from a unique perspective. I will show that understanding the common good as both instrumental and internal to the structure of the plurality of the basic goods clarifies Finney's concept of different explanatory levels of the common good, which should not be conceived as separate entities. Consequently, the common good is not mysterious, but its full comprehension necessitates a certain level of complexity that pertains to the true functioning of practical reason. So according to the narrow interpretation of the common good as merely instrumental, the common good in politics and law can be compared to a hammer used to construct a table or a spoon used to steal sugar. However, a close analysis of the use of common good by judges and legal practitioners and other officials present us with a more robust image. Despite the significance that judges, legal practitioners, and other officials place on the term, the common good of public interest can not only be instrumental in the sense that it simply creates the conditions for the citizens to choose the basic goods. This is because officials need to be able to A, identify the nature and character of the basic goods the state aims to implement and actualize, and B, understand how citizens participate in these goods to create the conditions for the instrumental good. So to put the point differently, the character and nature of the plurality of goods, as well as the citizens' participation in these goods, intertwine with the concept of the common good. This interpretation, while dense and its justification intricate, provides the most plausible interpretation of the passage's explanatory levels and the interconnectedness of these three senses of the common good. However, when the state determines and engages with the basic goods, it does not imply that certain goods are exclusive to specific individuals and not available to others. The basic goods are good for any and every person. In other words, according to Plato and G. Moore, there is no conflict between the concepts of good for and good simpliciter. The state's arduous and complex task is to determine the character and nature of the plurality of the basic goods and its internal relation to the common good. Understanding the standard of excellence for participation in and cultivation of the plurality of goods as goods simplicity is crucial to grasping the common good as instrumental. For instance, understanding the best standard of medical training that will benefit a health system requires understanding the standard of excellence for participation in a specific health system by a specific population, as well as understanding what constitutes the best health for this population. However, the talk of health of this specific population does not imply health for them. Instead, following Moore, it should refer to their participation in the basic good health. By contrast, the standard of an excellent hammer or spoon to perform their functions are external and already given. I do not need to understand the nature or process of the sugar dissolving into my coffee to understand that the best instrument to steer sugar is a spoon. One might argue that the idea of the common good as merely instrumental is helpful and safe because it shields against officials' moral error, irrationality, or evil in determining the citizens' particular good. This position would argue that the state or government will only provide the conditions for the participation in the plurality of the good as we provide a hammer for a nail or a spoon for steering the sugar. However, this stance presupposes that officials possess the ability to recognize the variety of goods, understand the requirements, and establish or attain suitable conditions for participation without delving into the nature and character of the plurality of goods. For example, imagine that a local government is building a children's library so that they hone their reading and thinking skills, resulting in their participation in the basic good of knowledge. The mere instrumental view that sees the official's action of the local authority as a hammer or a spoon will only require to buy books and build a building for the children's library. Although building and books are important, this will not be enough to help children develop their thinking skills and participate in the good of knowledge. To facilitate children's participation in knowledge, the local authority must comprehend how children form reading and thinking habits, identify the optimal infrastructure conditions for these habits, and identify the types of books that truly embody knowledge. My argument is that, in the example, the local government cannot engage with the common good as instrumental without considering the character and nature of the basic good, knowledge. However, we should not view this knowledge as knowledge for the children of this local community. However, we should not view this knowledge as knowledge for the children, but rather as a good that is integral to the structure of the common good. The officials of the local community must engage in a deliberative process to define what knowledge means for these children. However, this does not mean that good knowledge for them, but rather children's knowledge simplicity. In contrast to the so-called mere instrumental position that I have attempted to problematize, in which common good acts like a hammer or a spoon, there is another way of interpreting the relation between common good as instrumental and its relation to the plurality of goods. This is the idea that the common good is a grand end that the state or government aims to achieve or promote, We could read Murphy's notion of distinctive common good as a conception of the common good as grand end. Murphy defines the distinctive common good as follows, quote, "But there is within the natural law tradition of theorizing about politics a rival understanding of the common good that, like the aggregative conception, understand the common good in terms of intrinsic rather than instrumental goodness. What distinguishes this rival conception, what I call the distinctive good view, is that it holds that the common good is not composed out of the various goods of the members of that community. Rather, the good is the good of the community as a whole, what perfects the political community as such." So this distinctive common good could be interpreted as a unique social good, such as justice or peace, and it might be seen as a grand end that is promoted or realized by the state and its officials. Both ways of conceiving the common good as either a mere instrument, as if the law and officials' actions towards the common good were a spoon or a hammer, or a grand end and its relationship to the plurality of goods, are mistaken. These conceptions fail to accurately reflect the way officials' practical reasoning interacts with both the common good and the plurality of goods. I will demonstrate that the good cannot be something externally instrumental to be established, enabling the conditions for a plurality of the goods. To serve the basic goods in an appropriate manner, the common good must be internal and part of their structure. However, this does not mean that the common good as a whole is a grand end that can be clearly envisioned independently of the particularity of the action and the plurality of goods. I believe that Finnes's passage on explanatory levels and non-separation of the levels of the common good aims to highlight this point. This approach deeply engages the common good in evaluating the character and nature of the plurality of goods, as well as the eventual citizens' participation in these goods. This does not solve the problem of the inexorability of the good in our lives, and more importantly, in our collective lives, which is crucial for this set of premises to succeed in the liberal perfectionist debate. We can recognize that there is the good or a plurality of basic goods, but why do officials need to engage with it? The liberal would argue that officials can identify what is right and just without engagement with what is good. The proponent of the state's neutrality on matters related to what is good may argue that they simply fail to understand why decision-making at the institutional level requires consideration of what is good simpliciter, or common good, as integral to the internal structure of the basic goods. In other words, the concept of the common good is unnecessary. Furthermore, liberals could argue that this approach reinforces the idea that the state should only be involved with what is right. My proposed view of the common good is too thick or dense, as we essentially disagree over the nature and character of the good in a plural community. So this is the background and key motivation for this lecture series. I aim to show that good and common good are inexorable in our collective lives, and we cannot escape from them. I will proceed via negativa. My starting point is an explanation of how we deliberate and exercise our practical reasoning. This concept of deliberation, inspired by Aristotle, incorporates... Sorry about that. Yes. My starting point is an explanation of how we deliberate and exercise our practical reasoning. This concept of deliberation, His concept of deliberation, inspired by Aristotle, incorporates an aspirational aspect. I believe we engage in the indeterminate what of the action through its how and vice versa. This account of practical deliberation sheds light on several arguments, revealing that the notion of the common good as the grand end of deliberation is based on a series of misunderstandings and false perspectives. As a result, I conclude that the common good as instrumental is internal to the plurality of the goods. My position supplements the communitarian perspective, which concludes that goods are constitutives of who we are. However, I go a step further to explain how the good is constitutive within a political and legal community and emphasize a plight of inexorability of the good in our collective lives, and hence the common good. The key argument posits that neither goods nor the common good are subject to promotion or are already predetermined. Neither there are reasons for actions that are clear and presented to us prior to an engagement with practical reason and a collective, let's call, Socratic dialectic process of deliberation. It is not true that there is an inference from principles to the particulars of the action, nor is there an inferential determinatio in terms of the content of principles and or goods. The concept of good and the plurality of goods are elements in which we actively participate. In the next two lectures, I will focus on rejecting the picture of the common good as grand end, and therefore indirectly demonstrating that the common good is both instrumental and internal to the structure of the plurality of goods, resulting from practical reasoning. As a result, the lectures indirectly show that good is inexorable. The second section will discuss a potential objection to the proposed view. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Professor Veronica. And we have now a session of short discussions and comments with Professor Barzotto and myself. We'll have 15 minutes maximum for our comments or reactions, and then we'll have a general discussion with the auditorium. Okay, Barzotto, thanks.
Gracias por la invitación. He sido autorizado por el staff y por Verónica a hablar em espanhol. Vou evitar falar em portunhol. Wittgenstein disse que não há linguagem privado, há linguagem privado. Todo portunhol de brasileiro é linguagem privado. Okay? Então, vou ler para evitar causar mais dano ao espanhol. Okay? Duas perguntas, Verônica. Bem comum sobre a natureza do vínculo entre os cidadãos, amistade política e o bem comum. Toda comunidade se constitui em vista de bem, Aristóteles, não? Esse bem é o bem comum da comunidade. O vínculo entre os membros da comunidade, Aristóteles o denomina amistade. Entre os membros da comunidade política, a amistade política pode ser de duas naturezas. Ou bem se busca o bem comum basando-se em interesse próprio, e temos uma amistade baseada em interesse utilidade, ou o bem comum é buscado por pessoas cuja possessão de virtude les hace priorizar o bem da cidade por encima de seu próprio bem personal. Então, temos a amistade por virtude. Em sentido instrumental, que é o terceiro sentido de finis, o bem comum é conjunto de condições produzidas por el Estado que favorecem os bens básicos buscados por los cidadãos para que puedan alcançar por si mesmos a vida buena. Aqui o bem comum é o bem comum agregativo de Murphy. É a suma de los bens acessíveis a las personas. O bem comum político é compartido entre os cidadãos. Aqui é utilizado a distinção entre compartir e participar. Eu penso que em inglês seria participate and share, ok? es una distinción oriunda de Castoriadis. El bien común es compartido entre los ciudadanos. Al compartir, cada persona toma propiedad de su parte, se apropria de su parte, excluyendo la otra. Cada persona busca su propio bien en el bien común. La amistad política se basa, entonces, en interés personal o utilidad. La gente se une para crear un bien que se comparte entre todos los miembros de la comunidad política. Y ahora, basta, yo pienso una cita, ¿no? Una cita de la ética a Nicómaco. La amistad política se constituye principalmente sobre la base de la utilidad, pues parece que los seres humanos, no siendo autosuficientes, se han unido, aunque también se hayan unido para vivir juntos. Esse é um problema para mim, porque em republicanismo e na tradição comunitarista, a amistad política é uma amistad por virtude. Só que Aristóteles, que é o autor de referência, habla que é amistad por interesse. Então, ok, ha dado um tilt em minha cabeça, ok? Há um problema acá. Há outras duas citas, mas eu penso que não é necessário. Solamente esta acá que diz assim: em las amistades entre pessoas diferentes. E Aristóteles disse: la polis é uma pluralidade, não é uma homogeneidade, como pensa Platão, é uma pluralidade. Então, a amistade se dá entre os diferentes. Em las amistades entre pessoas diferentes, é a proporcionalidade em los intercâmbios lo que estabelece a igualdade e preserva a amistade. Assim, em la amistade política, el zapatero obtiene a compensação devida por seus sapatos, al igual que el sastre e outros artesanos. A troca mercantil, el cambio mercantil, é colocado por Aristóteles como o paradigma da amistade política. Bueno, então se pensa que a amistade política é solamente por interesse. Então, o terceiro sentido de bem comum, não? Se se adopta o sentido instrumental de bem comum, a amistade entre os cidadãos se basará em interesse ou utilidade. Pero, agora vamos para o outro sentido do bem comum. O sentido interno, primeiro e segundo sentido de finis, bem comum designa o hecho de que é participado. Participar não é compartir. Compartir é participar excluindo, apropriar-se excluindo o outro. Tá? Em la participação, se apropria incluindo o outro. É o contrário, não? O bem comum aqui só pode ser o bem comum distintivo, é o bem da comunidade em seu conjunto. Os exemplos de Castoriadis são as costumbres e a língua. Só puedo me apropriar da língua, incluindo o outro, não excluindo o outro, não? Exemplos de Murphy. Paz e justiça. Tá? Em la participação, cada membro solo pode apropriar-se de um bem incluindo os demais. Cada um busca o bem comum como o bem da cidade. Este parece ser o significado do bem comum a que se refere Aristóteles em La Ética a Nicômaco, em capítulo 1. Aunque o bem da cidade, início da cita, aunque o bem da cidade e do indivíduo são o mesmo, é evidente que será maior e mais perfeito lograr o bem da cidade. Isso se deve a que é certamente desejável buscar o bem de uma pessoa, pero mais hermoso e divino buscar o bem de um pueblo e de uma cidade. Aquele bem comum, com fim da cita, aquele bem comum como o bem de la polis parece ser o fim último da ação de los membros da associação política, e a amistade política entre eles parece estar basada em la virtude. Outra cita de Aristóteles: é certo que el hombre bueno, espudaios, hace muitas coisas por seus amigos e por sua cidade, incluso muriendo por eles, se é necessário. O bem comum não pode ser a suma de los interesses particulares. Se vou a morir por la cidade, só pode ser um bem distintivo aqui, em termos de Murphy, não? Se se adota o sentido interno do bem comum, então a amistade política se basará em la virtude e não em interesse. O artículo pretende unir de forma articulada e muito bem argumentada, o sentido instrumental interno do bem comum. A pergunta é: qual é a natureza, interesse ou virtude da amistade entre os cidadãos? Ou é os dois ao mesmo tempo, Verônica? Ok? E outra pergunta muito rápida sobre razão prática. el lugar de la verdad práctica en la deliberación política. Los agentes públicos, officials, estão obrigados a deliberar sobre os bienes que compõem o bem comum. Foi muito bem demonstrado. Em Aristóteles, toda deliberação que une o desejo com o bem se mide por la verdade prática. No todo desejo é desejo de um bem verdadeiro. ¿Okay? La buena deliberación es la que llega a la verdad práctica. La mala deliberación, la que no llega a ella. Ahora la cita de Aristóteles, inicio de la cita. Para que la elección sea buena, el razonamiento debe ser verdadero y el deseo correcto. Y lo que la razón dice y lo que el deseo persigue deben ser lo mismo. Esta clase de comprensión y verdad es práctica. El bien de la razón práctica es la verdad práctica. La pregunta es, en el modelo de deliberación propuesto por Verónica, inspirado por Aristóteles, ¿hay lugar para el concepto de verdad práctica? Muchas gracias, Verónica.
Sí, sí. Thank you so much. So it's okay if I reply? Yes,
okay.
Wonderful. Well, this is a very thought-provoking comment. Thank you very much, Luis, and very difficult to answer in one package because this is still a work in progress. So let me rephrase your question. So shall I start with the last one, which I think is a bit easier? So you and rightly so, you pose at the center the question of virtue, and I think that's related also to your first question. And I'm just focusing on the practical reasoning of the official, of the person who is building up and constructing in social institutions, right? And you quote a passage of book 6, of the Nicomachean Ethic, in which Aristotle says it's not only about the right end, but actually about the right desire and the right way of understanding the means, right? And this is correct. And I'm just about to publish a book in which I try to demonstrate that there is what I call the aspirational deliberative point of view. And that the law, and more specifically, this is within the realm of private law. The law, specifically tort law, invites the citizen to put themselves in an aspirational point of view, yes, through reasoning and through presentation of description of specific values. And I argue this is the task more specific of the judges in the common law. So what I'm just flagging here is that is not very much about identifying the values, but actually a transformational process that the citizen is engaged with through the thinking of the specific values of the cases in the law. So then, therefore, the idea is that it is possible to have a transformation towards a right desire in the collective through a conversation that I call only the law can do it, because it's the law that is imposing through the command of their legal authority what is of value. So the idea here is that actually there is, hopefully, a position of the mature citizen that has the right desires. So I don't think I'm engaged in what is called virtue theory as such. Why? Because I'm engaging more in understanding what action is, the nature of action, specifically intentional action as the paradigmatic case of action, but also all the kinds of action, recklessness and negligent action. But also understanding, I try to also understand how this is related to something more aspirational without yet talking about virtues. So my criticism of virtue theory is that they immediately start with a set of virtues without focusing completely on the question of practical reasoning and understanding the complexity of practical reasoning. So I hope that, there are some skeptical voices, which I think are very important, like Bernard Williams, in Making Sense of Humanity. In this work, he points out that it's not possible to have a combination of the so-called mature citizen and a conception of justice. And that therefore we need to give up the dream or the illusion that there is a notion of practical reason, that together we can achieve a thick conception of the value or the good in the particular circumstances. So he's skeptical of the Nicomachean project on practical reason towards right desire, right? Transformation towards right desire. And he thinks that what is sufficient, what is enough, is a conception of justice that is minimal, in which your space is not invaded by my exercise of my freedom, and that my space is not invaded by the exercise of your freedom. So there are important skeptical voices that I'm trying as well to undermine, and I think this is important. But I think the general gist of the project is demonstrating that actually law plays a very important role in the transformation of the citizen, without yet arguing in favor of virtue theory, what are the kinds of virtue. This is too fast, too quick, without understanding actually how we err, how our mistakes in practical reasoning actually happen, yeah, how vice is generated. So rather than virtue ethics, I call it vice ethics, right? The ethics of our vices. And if we understand that, probably then we can, establish an interesting path to think more about virtue ethics in a different way. And that takes me to your first question. So you're right that he says that there are three kinds of friendship, right? The friendship of a mere utility or interest, but he also says that there is the friendship of pure pleasure, right, exploitation. And then the third kind of friendship, which is for him the central case or the core case, in which there is the friendship among the moral man. And I think in order to make sense of this, as you say, he thinks that in a way some passages might interpret that actually in the notion of political friendship is only in terms of utility of interest. But I think we need to read him in terms of this methodology, that in the central case is among the man of moral virtue, among the man who have the right desire. So it's not precisely the methodology of the central case, is that this case is the intelligible case. And the others make sense only because somehow we have a vague conception of this, perfect case or central case or core case. So I love the dialectic. It's really interesting. I never thought about that. Thank you. Between sharing and participating. And then when I'm trying, in a way, you're right, demonstrating that participating not only in language and traditions and customs, but actually, and you're right to actually appeal to Wittgenstein here and the forms of life, but actually that this sharing extends to values. Yeah. But it's not a metaphysical sharing, right? It's not the participation, it's not the participation in the sense of a pure metaphysical point, but it's in a participation through the forms of life, through the language, and through practical reason. And so that's the task of unpacking all these that I'm trying to engage with.
Thank you, Veronica.
Yeah. I hope it addresses some of your. Thank you very much, Luis. Yeah.
Okay, so I take the word myself, take the floor. Right. I don't think I have questions. I'll make some comments and wait for your reaction. And I begin with basically the idea of how we conceive of the common good. One way of understanding the common good is saying that the common good is the good for everyone indistinctive. You said that. That's the basic good. And in this sense, Rawls and Finnis can agree. For Rawls, there are basic goods, which are universal and necessary for every human being. And for Finnis, likewise, there are goods which are also universal, his list of basic goods. That could be one sense of common good, you explained, which is, I don't think, is what we are looking for. One problem with this conception is that the goods, although universal, are enjoyed individually and can be enjoyed individually. Well, that's the case of health. Health is a good for everyone, but I enjoy my own health. So this is hard to understand as a common good. So one problem is that goods can be enjoyed individually if we stick to basic goods. This would lead us to think that the common good is just the aggregate of individual goods. However, this would miss what we call, or some people call, intrinsically common or social goods. Goods that we can only enjoy socially. They are shared goods. Goods like playing in a band, dancing, having friends, friendship, and performance in a band or chorus are good things in themselves, and they are good things that we can only enjoy with others. We cannot enjoy them alone. They have this intrinsically social and shared nature. That, for instance, makes a difference between attending a seminar and then watching it. Paul Ricoeur says, very interestingly, he says, there's quite a difference when we are in presence of someone and discussing with that person, and then when we read what the person has written. There is a distance, and this distance is distance in time for him and also in space. With this in mind, I believe we can talk about intrinsically common goods. We could describe them as goods in common. I've been saying this in Portuguese. Bens que temos em comum, which are not just things that exist and we can share, such as a beach or the streets. They are things we can only enjoy if they are shared, but these are things that we also have to create and maintain. And I think this is one of the reasons why Murphy makes this his criticism of Hobbes when talking about peace. He says, for Hobbes, peace is not actually common. It's not shared. Okay. So if I would ask you a question, is the common good you were talking about and the role of the government, of a sovereign or the authority to provide, is it the good that the state or the government has to provide, is it a good that can be shared individually and enjoyed individually, or is there a good that the government has to provide which can only be shared in common, like peace or justice? The example I would give, and as you said in the beginning of your presentation, we in Latin America, in South America, Latin America in general, have had this experience, is that the environment, the civic environment in which we live, does not really sustain this trust among citizens. We mistrust. I was reading some research done by some empirical research on the level of trust. Reciprocal trust is always reciprocal in citizens, and in Latin America we perform very poorly, in Brazil particularly, and we don't trust the other and we don't trust the authority. So wouldn't this kind of trust be a common good that can only be enjoyed in common and can only be produced in common? So my question is, I think in a way I agree with you. It's instrumental, but it's also more contentful than what the instrumental view says. So I have other things, but this is basically my idea. When discussing common good, thinking of these intrinsically goods, and if in the republic, in the polity, we have something that only the polity can provide for, which is common. That would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's again another important distinction. It's along the lines. So there are activities that we do together, right? So let's say playing in a band, you say having friends. And one feature is you make three distinctions. Let me go back. So you make the distinction that there are things that we only enjoy individually. Our health, right? So has a very particular feature. For example, if I'm diabetic, I need a specific kind of medicine. And if I suffer cancer, I need a special kind of treatment. So this is the enjoyment of health in a particular way. Then you say, well, but there is also kinds of activities that we have in common. Yeah. So you're exploring these two different ways of, and in contrast with the individuality of the former, of enjoyment, right? And the things we have in common is an activity I do with others. And I cannot do, for example, I cannot play tennis. Well, I can do it alone, but there's something unique of playing tennis together with two people, or three or four people, or playing football, or playing in a band, doing music together, discussing philosophy is a characteristic of thing that we can only do together. There's no point of being isolated from the philosophical. But I don't think I don't think that the state has much to do with the second one, right? With the playing of the activity. It could, as you say, provide the facilities for a tennis court, or could provide the university for these. And my point is, in having an instrumental good here, is that the state can, or the authority cannot provide this without understanding the substantive aspect, without understanding what tennis is about. So ideally, in a court of tennis, then you will have a kind of a socializing environment. It has to be an appropriate, from the technical point of view, but also to encourage kind of friendship within the club and so on. The same for philosophizing. We have to have the students who have the right standard, the right intellectual standard, so have to pass what is called A-levels or bachillerato, right? So for continue the philosophical conversation. So there has to be an instrumental aspect. And then you talk about the goods in common, right? That we can only create and maintain together. And for that, you think that the instrumentality is also essential. And the instrumentality is connected to the substantive aspect. Yeah. But am I right to say that you think that the former is different from the latter? Because the former, in the case of the health, is only an individual enjoyment. But I'm trying to think about how we get there, how we are going to determine what diabetic treatments we're going to give to the general population, or what kind of cancer treatment we will be able to give to the patients who suffer a specific, or how we are going to use the new technologies. So, and also to have peace and justice, right? You think that this is in common, as opposed, or something that is common that we enjoy, and thus it makes a difference. So can I invite you to elaborate, what does it mean that is in common? Because my point here is precisely that to determine the particularity of the what is just between two people, I need to engage in a same process of practical reason as to determine how to cater for the specific diabetic patient. So this is the argument, and I see the parallel. And I think you're right that it has been thought, and there is the temptation to think that justice or peace, because it's something in common, is a grand end. And I'm trying to resist that, because we don't understand how justice looks for Brazil or for the political community in Sao Paulo without the process of dialogue and deliberation, for practical reason of every citizen. And so this is what I'm trying to demonstrate in the book. So they both are similar. There's a similar structure, and there's not such a thing as a distinctive good or in common. Maybe you're right. Maybe the outcome will be, justice is in common, and that your treatment of it as a diabetic. You're right. Maybe the outcome, but I'm trying to demonstrate that the process of thinking is exactly the same. And that, it helps me a lot, these comments, because that is something that I need to exploit to say, this is my contribution, is saying that they are exactly the same. And we need to think very hard on how the Socratic dialogue works. So I'm trying to say that there is a process of deliberation And I'm going to give you some ideas here. So on these, so there's a process of deliberation in which you are challenged on your premises through a dialogue, right?
Mhm.
And then because you are challenged on the premises, you are forced to move on your own reason in a different way. And that can be only done through the liberation of a community with the other. And that is the essential nature of practical reason in the process of building the common good, I think.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think that certain goods, which are instrumental to individual goods, like health, let's stick to the example of health, is more like one dimension of practical reasoning, which you mentioned here, which is techne. That is, you have an end product which is external to the action itself. When I'm thinking of peace or justice, we can call them products, but they are not external, either to the institutions or to the agents of the institution. A judge who thinks of justice as something he will deliver and will end there, I think is a little bit different. That would be my point.
That's brilliant.
And then I think that justice, I mean, these goods, as they are not material in the sense of molecular, like trust. I mean, it is a community as a whole, of course, let's say, helped by the authority, which is a community resource, that has to provide. I was thinking of the period of COVID and the lack of cooperation, both on the part of the government. In our case, we were under the special regime, and authoritarian government, and on the citizens in general. And then you saw that the lack of this trust, of this civility, was the lack of a good, actually. That's my point. I mean,
Okay,
we have
that's
to
very
think about
good.
that.
Okay,
Yeah.
now I understand the difference. This is very good. So yes, and that's the difference, because I think it's all about, it's not technique.
Hmm.
And I explain you why. The doctor, we have the technique of practical reason.
Right.
Right? So the doctor will know what is the correct treatment to produce the right outcome. So the substantive aim for the substantive end, for the doctor is the reduction, let's say in the case of the cancer patient, reduction of the cells that are abnormal and increase of the normal cells, right? So that's through the chemotherapy. However, because we're talking about the state and the actors, the state agents, I think this is an ethical question. And I give you the difference between what is called, well, the technique, right? The operational practical reason in technique, as opposed to ethique or ethics of politics. So the expert demonstrates his knowledge of practical reason, building a defective outcome. So in the case of the patient, of the doctor, he can produce more illness onto the patient, and he will demonstrate that through that his expertise. An engineer will build a broken bridge, a crook. A dentist will put your teeth crooked, demonstrating his expertise. Whereas in the case of ethics, the problem is that we don't have an external aim, right? End. So therefore, all the way through, the engagement is ethical for both, to determine, not only to determine, because the agent, the state agent, is not only trying to determine what is it from the expert point of view, the correct treatment for the patient, but what kind of resources and how a good health for this patient looks. And that only through the internal process of practical reasoning, while deliberating and rediscovering the content of them, the end is vague, to give as many possible patients a correct treatment in terms of new oncology and new technologies, but with limited resources. So that's why I think that there is a process that is ethical all the way through. So that's the difference. And of course, he will rely on the technique. He will rely on the expert knowledge. So you're right. I think there is and I had this discussion with some of the regionalists on constitutional law. They think that to interpret the intention, the collective intention of the founding fathers of the US Constitution is a technique. And I think no, it's all practical reason, ethical all the way through. And the creation of trust on the part of the agents of the administrator or the authority, of the legal authority and the state government, actually their task on trust is through a process of deliberation. And I think it starts with a small political community.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, so absolutely. We can open.
I would just want to ask you, you want to take one question, one answer, or maybe a back or two or
Oh,
three?
no, we should do it, yes, backward and forwards would be nice.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
yes.
So yeah, maybe we should make a list.
Yes,
Yeah,
Danielle?
we could. So, yeah, we can
Ronaldo?
take like 4 questions. Professor Ronaldo, Professor Carlos, Professor Joubert. I would like to propose a question if I can
Yes.
abuse of my powers.
Okay, so let's see.
Thank you very much, Professor Veronica. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And as you know, my name is Ronaldo Macedo from USP Law School. And in my graduate classes last week, we discussed one of your articles, which is called "Is Finis Wrong?" And in this text, you basically make a criticism against Finis in terms of his committed essentialism, in a way. And you, in a way, suggest to replace this idea of some view of how concepts are made, replace it with the idea of family resemblances from Wittgenstein. So my question here is this. What is the status, what is the nature of the very concept of common good? Because in the natural law, Aristotelian or Phoenician tradition is still committed with this, with some kind of essentialism. And very clearly in that text, you are attacking this way of seeing, way of describing the concept, the nature of the concept. So this is the first question. How would you manage to work with these two ideas? And second, as a subpart or follow-up from this, what would be your view about labeling or conceptualizing the concept of common good as interpreted concept in Dworkinian terms? How would you, what would be your objections in behaving this way?
Yes, so shall we start from the second question? Ronaldo, what would you, how would you interpret Dworkin's conception of common good, if there is anything there?
No, I mean, I wonder if common good could be well described as an interpretive concept.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
In
Yeah,
Dworkinian
yeah,
terms.
very good. Oh, yeah, it's clear now. Yes, I think something. I mean, I have written about this, a criticism of Dworkin, Law's Empire. So in Law's Empire, Dworkin thinks that as we know, he uses the metaphor of the chain novel. So he thinks that the task is explain the justification of the state coercion. So therefore, inevitably, the judges are involved in a task of adjudicating, and therefore a task that involves justification, giving reasons to the citizens why the state is coercing them. And following the chain novel, we know that actually the right answer in law given by this judge who's trying to justify the question of the state is in light of two criteria. One, the criteria of fitting the past legal materials. So all the materials that have to do are related to the specific question of what is the law in this case. And also as a second criteria of correctness or right answer in law is according to the integrity, moral integrity. So the judge has to, in a way, juggle or rest between the fitness criteria, between fitting the judgment to the past, to the historical sources, to the factual sources, let's call it that way, but he doesn't call it that like that, and a correct interpretation of in the best light. So the problem with this view is that it's always an attribution. It's an attribution of the judge of what is the value of the specific activity. So, for example, when the judge is asked whether Mrs. McLaughlin should be compensated for her injury, which is only psychological injury, psychiatric shock, and it's not a physical injury, the judge has to interpret the past legal material in its best light, in the moral light. But the value that it gives to, let's say, the physical integrity of Mrs. McLaughlin is a value that is the judge given to the specific, injury of the physical integrity of Mrs. McLaughlin. So it's an adjudicative process. It's all an attribution of value. It's not a process of practical reason. And in a way, funny, there's no practical reason, I think, in working. I know this is controversial. There is only interpretation as a theoretical exercise. It's a theoretical exercise because it's always the judge doesn't try to discover what exactly is the objective value that has been infringed by the violation, of the physical integrity of Mrs. McLaughlin in the case of the psychiatric injury. So I think that is a big difference between the Dworkinian view and the Phoenician view. The Phoenician view puts practical reason at the core. So, natural law, we have learned that, and this is the classical new natural law theory, is that there is no metaphysical point. This is not an abstraction, right? The good is not something that we can see, that we can grasp, that we can intuit, that we can formulate. We need practical reason. There is always mediation through reasoning, because practical reason is at the core of all the basic values. There are no other the basic values of health, life, and so on are irrelevant without practical reason. So practical reason is a process of uncovering, and it's a structure. The argument, following Aquinas, Aristotle, and Anscombe, is a structure. Is the way we act and think. It's a fundamental structure of us. It's the naive view of our way we think about value and things. And when you talk about essentialism, you're right. In that paper, I try to think differently from this idea that the central case is an ideal case and we all understand it. And this is a coming back home there and to that paper that was written in 2007, is if there is always an engagement of practical reason, then the end appears usually unclear to us. And it's only through a process of dialogue and understanding and thinking and moving our reason and right desires that actually the end of any activity is unpacked. And this is a common experience. We didn't have any idea what is the value of having children until we have children, until we change the nappies, until we bath them. We have no idea what marriage is and love is, and friendship is, until we get along with it and think about what is the meaning of everything we do every day. And then, of course, then becomes clear to us what is the end. And then we adjust our means to the better realization of this end and backward and forward. So this is the core argument. So you're right, there is because essentialism is something very modern. So there is the temptation to read Plato in light of Kant, or the temptation to read Aristotle in light of Hume. So, but I think the classical thinking, way of thinking, has a different way of thinking about, you know, the being of being, the accident, or the methodology of the central case, the analogical reasoning. Yeah.
Carlos.
Thank you, Professor Veronica, for the very insightful talk. My question is about in the end of the text, when you say that we can recognize that there's the good or a plurality of basic goods, but why do officials need to engage with it? The liberal would argue that officials can identify what is right and just without engagement with what is good. The question is, Rawls famously said that the right shows the big picture and the good shows the point. So there is an assumption from the liberal side that there is a necessity of the good in the thinking, but of a thin theory of the good and not a thick theory of the good. Like Professor José Reinaldo said, that there's a common aspect between Finney's basic goods and Rawls' basic goods as well. So is your argument about, is your case for the common good or for the inexorability of good and common good in reasoning? Does it apply, are you arguing that a thick theory of good or of common good is necessary in practical reasoning of officials applying the law? Or would it be enough to say that a thin theory of good is enough for applying the law concerning officials who does it? Because the liberal argument states that a thin theory of the good is necessary because there are conceptions of good that we don't share, that are very particular, very individual, but some conception of good is necessary to deliberate. So this is stated very clearly, for example, by Rawls. So my question would be, is it a thin theory of good enough for the inexorability of good, or are you making a case for the inexorability of a thick theory of good in deliberation by officials? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, you're right. So in Rawls, the right is prior to the good, right? So then therefore you're right. You have a thin conception of the good that what it does is it overlooks completely the process of practical reason. So it creates an artificiality on how the citizen engages and do the activities. So that's the argument. And of course, I mean, I haven't argued that here, but there's this, I think, illusion, or that precisely there is this thing that is the grand end, yeah, that is the common good, and that has a final content for the particular community, and that the task of the agents administrator is just to grasp it, to understand it, and then apply it. And I'm trying to show that this is a caricature, that there's no such a thing as a grand end. And this is, I think, that why the position of liberalism is so strong, because everyone would say, listen, I want to own that, the conception of the good that I'm going to engage with in my life and engage my friends and my family with. So I think I need to be part of the construction of the conception of the good. So Rawls, what he does, he says, no worries, because we construct a system of rights in which you can add any good, yeah, like, you know, it's like a recipe. Oh, don't worry, we give you the basic of the dough and you can create your own pizza, yeah? You have your own, you know, prosciutto and your mozzarella and your vegetarian option and so on. And I'm saying, this is not how we reason. and the state agent cannot identify this neutral point, inevitably the state agent will advance his own or her own conception of the good. It will be just disguised. It will be under the flag or the emblem or the rubric of right. And this is what I don't demonstrate it here, but this is part of also demonstrating how problematic is the conception of internal and internal freedom. Yeah, it's very closely related. As soon as I'm in interaction with Louis, I see his suffering, his mind. I see his goodness and his values and his mind. So there's no space of the exercise of freedom like two billards, no? This is the metaphor of Kant in external freedom, that they can really interact in a very particular way. I'm trying to demonstrate that the relationship between us is immediately thick. And we better think about that very seriously. And that's why we're having, the emergence of conception of politics that is not, so liberalism is unstable in a way. There's a lot written about this, but I haven't demonstrated this. But the question is very relevant. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much, Professor Veronica, for an amazing talk and for making all the way to Brazil. Long way. I promise I'll make it a very quick question. You seem, in your response to Professor Barzotto, you seem to be skeptical about a virtue-based approach on the common good, and you opt instead, it seems to me at least, that you opt instead for a more hermeneutical approach, a more deliberative approach on the meaning of the good and the common good. But I think at the same time on the philosophy, for example, of Philippa Foot, and she says that we cannot think of the good action without the idea of virtue in the background, and virtue as conceived as virtue because of who we are as human animals. So can we proceed this way without the idea of virtue? I mean, can we do without it?
Yeah. So thank you so much. So you're right. I mean, as we know, virtue is a stability of character, right? And has three specific features. One is that the agent who does things knows what he's doing and why he's doing, right? He does it or she does it for its own sake, not merely instrumental way. And thirdly, there is an stability of character that enables the pursuit of the ends, yeah, as she conceives them, as there is knowledge of the matter, right? So in the book that is about to be published, there is a whole section on this conception, Aristotelian inspiration conception of practical reason or deliberation. And it's the recognition that we are animals. And Aristotle, for that, establishes two analogies on how practical reason works. So one analogy is the so-called craft analogy, and the other is the theoretical analogy. So the craft analogy says that practical reason is like a craft. And that means that actually to achieve the ends, you have to think about how the means are connected one to each other, right? How they are connected in order to achieve the specific end. So let me put you these examples of, as a dentist, I have a certain expert knowledge. So I have clarity of the end. Sorry, I should start with a much more intuitive craft. Let's think about knitting, right? So you want to knit a beautiful jumper for your niece. So you know the kinds of textures that she likes, the colors. So you have this knowledge, and you think about knitting, and that itself, the knitting transforms you and enables you to reach the end. So you know what are the means, the correct kinds of needles that you need, the correct correct colors that you need, and the shape that your knees, the jumper of your knee needs. He also makes an interesting analogy. So this former analogy is connected to our animality. Yeah. So desire is fundamental. You have to desire, in a way, you have to be prone to the activity to produce the jumper for your knees. And this is usually presented in the guise of the good, in the belief. So remember, good is nothing substantive here. Good is a form. Yeah. So you don't say to yourself, oh, to need this jumper for my niece is good. No, you think immediately, oh, my niece is very cold. It's getting very cold in Sao Paulo. Let's give her a jumper, right? So there is a huge background presuppositions here, right? You live in winter, you know, a jumper will protect her from the cold and so on and so on. So there is this animality thing here that is the desire, but this desire is a desire of thinking. Only us can reflect about the way whether this good is objective or the right one. Yeah, and only us can do it. We have two powers. We can produce a jumper that is fake, no, made out of plastic that will not protect it, and a jumper that is beautiful. So that's the power of a rational capacity. Then there is a second analogy, which is a theoretical analogy. And he thinks, let me give you this example. So he thinks that in theoretical reasoning, what you do is you decompose until you get the final component of this, you know, whatever theoretically you're thinking about. So the best example is when you think about a parallelogram. We know parallelograms are constituted by triangles. So you know that the triangle is the last component of a parallelogram. And he says that this is the beginning of your action. So the end is the parallelogram, but the basic constituent element is actually the triangle. You only will be able to draw the parallelogram if you start from the triangle. And this is very important because here we see that actually what you think as the last bit of the change is the first in action, what you think theoretically. So now, in the case of the parallelogram in a way is abstract, is undefined, and you only understand the full content of this parallelogram only after you finish it. So I think there is this interaction of what the nature of a rational desire is. A rational desire is something that has both, has an emotion, yeah, and emotions are in a craft because you desire to produce something. You desire to bring that about in the world in a specific way. Yeah. And obviously you need to align your desires with your thinking. And that's only through a rational process of thinking about the value of the thing that you're doing, about the end, the parallelogram. So you're thinking about how to give her the best protection to her for her cold and you know, the rains and so on. So maybe a little hat as well will be good for the rain and so on. So I think that you don't need to go immediately to define the virtue ethics because there is not enough elaboration on this concept of practical reasoning, how it is, and how it's actually so much down to earth, in which, and this is the point of Lewis, that there's a transformation, and that's where virtue works. And then you have the different characters, the phronesim, the phronimos, you have the acratic, and you have the encratic, the man who is not attracted to the good, but has to make an effort. And I have made quite a lot of elaboration based on this conception of practical reason. So I think, in other words, as a summary, and sorry that it has been so long, so as a summary, the idea is that actually we need to pay more attention to how practical reason works and how our beliefs shape our desire and vice versa to really understand what virtue is. I don't think that the virtue theory help us. What I have seen is sometimes the claim, for example, Juliana says, oh, intelligence is important skill for our skills, no? Intelligence, or some people are talking about emotions or the different virtues, that virtues are necessary. But there is not much of a link with how practical reason ought to be understood.
So we have a question from Danielle.
Yeah.
Maybe, is there
anyone
else?
Okay.
Yes, you are. And
Okay.
after Danielle then, okay? Someone else? Martin.
So, Professor, first and foremost, we are very privileged to have you here. It's not a question, it's more like a development of Professor Reinaldo's comment. I would like for you to know, I mean, for to elaborate more in the conception of the deliberatio, the process in which we deliberate, because you say the goods are not predetermined. So how are they determined? I'm thinking, of course, about Gitch's boy and girl fallacy. Like every X wants some Y, but there's not a single Y every X wants. I do not think Aristotle makes a fallacy there, but I know there is a discussion. I would like very much to hear you about it. This determinatio, the determination of the good, is it in the public discourse? Is it in politics? We vote for it? How we do it? Is it in linguistic tradition? Just to hear you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Yes. So yes. So and this is a continuity of these chapters of my book on negligence, right? Negligence is a very interesting case. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so negligence is a very interesting case because in negligence you have something happens to you, and somehow you were doing it voluntarily, and it seems that I'm not going to say that there was an intention, but then something really goes wrong within your action. And the question is how this is possible. So I'm trying to explain that there is a way in which the thinking and our desires interact. If you think about your desires and the way you're doing while you are doing things, you are able to modify it or align your desires to your thinking. And I'm arguing that when your desires and your thinking are not aligned, what there is acrasia or incontinence, right? And I think that, I try to argue in the book that acrasia is the underpinning principle, underpinning phenomenon of negligence. And this is important because of this. Then, of course, I have to explain how the good action works, how the way in which we align our thinking and our desires work. And I explain this conception of practical deliberation, in which first I put this example. So when we all have a general aim or the overall end of life to have a good life, right? A flourishing life. But this is, of course, yet when you start as a teenager, it doesn't have any content yet. And I'm trying to argue that it's only in the process of engaging with the specific deliberations in your life. For example, the girlfriends you have, the studies you engage with, which this end of flourishing life start to get a shape. Yeah, and there is a kind of directionality, yeah, of this absolute or conception of the good, yeah, a directionality. Now, of course, there are also a specific and short ends, yeah, and long-term ends. For example, graduating from the law school, obtaining a PhD, or short ends. And also, I argue that they operate exactly in the same way. When you have organized this conference, you didn't know the exact shape that it will take, and now all of a sudden, a lot of questions arise. On Wednesday, we improve the format because we see that the conversation can flow in this and that way. And this is exactly the engagement with practical reason. So I think that what I'm trying, and I think you have to give you the opposite account. The opposite account is understanding practical reasoning as a practical syllogism, where the major premise is the content of the good or something good. The minor premise is the particularity, and then the conclusions, it depends on who you read. Something is an action and something is the proposition. I think, or another way of thinking, or you have principles and then you have the determinatio. And I think there is no need of practical reason, because one feature of practical reason is mediation. It mediates between means and ends, but these ends are also abstracts, and you can go backward and refine the ends. And I'm trying to demonstrate that this is the structure of the good action. Of course, you have to have a directionality. And here I said is the others, in interaction with others that invite you to locate or inhabit yourself in the aspirational point. And I use Iris Murdoch to demonstrate that. Yeah, when people say, well, what have you done that? You know, didn't you notice that you've been rude to her or rude to him? And then you go back and next time you do it better. And this is the invitation that the law does and also the community. And I trying to argue in this book that this is exactly how the liberation in the collectivity is. So when it's in a way continuity of philosophical task. The thing is that we lost the confidence in how the Socratic dialogue works, and we gave the public space only to the economist or to the technical knowledge. And that's why there's no trust anymore. Yeah, so I hope it answers that. Yeah, but there's a lot. I mean, I haven't done it, I haven't demonstrated, but that's what the aim of the book. So this gives you an aperitif of what's coming, hopefully.
When it's published, you come back here and
Exactly,
we argue it again.
There can be a better place than Latin America to do it.
That would
Yeah.
be great. Actually.
Hi. Thank you, Professor, for being here, and thank you, the professors who organized for us. It's a privilege. My question is quick. It's about something you said earlier. I was curious, when you're talking about dworking, you said there is no practical reason in dworking.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you meant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes. So, yeah. So, working. I mean, I think there's a theory of interpretation. I'm just talking about Law's Empire mainly because I think that's the best of his work. So there's a theory of interpretation, and I have demonstrated this in a paper that is called, has been published with the Canadian Journal of Law and Jurisprudence 2016, and it's something called like dworkings in action or something like that. So there is always in dworking an attribution. It's always from, it's paradoxical because I think Dworkin, the best of his work, his insight is actually that the judge is the center of the creation of the law, at least in the common law. And so therefore we need to understand the judge. And that I would assume is from what is so-called first-person perspective, right? How the judge values or how the judge sees the value. But rather than engaging in practical reason, at least in any of the classical tradition that I recognize, he says there is an attribution of the value, or that when you engage in the moral integrity of reading the past legal decision in the best light, there is an attribution. Remember the examples, I can't remember which chapter, but there's the example of pre-interpretive practice, and I think the man or women the man taking off the hat in the church, and he says at the pre-interpretive level we have to attribute a value to the practice. The point of the practice is all an attribution. It's not the engagement with the agent who is doing the practice, and you ask the agent, why are you taking off the hat? That will be exactly the practical reason. So the task of practical reason is to understand the structure. So it's not that you answer to the question why in the Anscombe way, right? Or in the Aristotelian way, the means and ends, right? So there's no interest in the real structure of the agent. There's only an interest on how the judge attributes the point of the practice, because he's building the past, he's building the history of the. And there's another way to think about traditions. There is a value that emerges from the tradition, not a value that is attributed by us at the distance to the tradition. You see the difference? That's why he's a progressist and not a conservative. Whereas in the conservative view, the tradition has a value, and we extract it and reconstruct it as we go along. That is the biggest difference. Yeah. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, Mark.
Don't know if there is anyone else, but a short question. You quoted very quickly now again Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe, and a quick question would be: could you elaborate a little bit more how her work influenced you? Because I see echoes of the second thesis of modern moral philosophy, her famous paper, that we cannot do ethics before a good philosophy of psychology. And your answers to Professors Luis and Jose, for me, was kind of like you were saying something like this: we need a good, strong philosophy of action before speaking about these terms more substantively. So we could elaborate a little bit
Yeah,
more.
you're absolutely right. And I think that was, I mean, I discovered in 2009, very late in my career, because I finished my PhD in 2000. So 9 years later, I discovered this wealth of literature on Anscombe. And then, of course, through her, I went to Aristotle and Aquinas. And I think the beauty of this tradition is to take seriously the animality and the rationality and combine it together. And I think you're right, a strong and robust conception of a theory of action that is not a mental state, is from the norm-observational point of view, is an answer to something that is to why as a structure and has a directionality, help us to understand how we actually deliberate. So I don't know if you know the book of Thompson on life, form and life, that Michael Thompson. There is an illuminated complementary idea here about what I'm trying to put forward, that we have a form, yes? And this form has a certain structure, and this is a naive view. And it's better grasped when you say, I am, for example, giving a lecture. I am having a coffee, in the progressive form of the verb. So has a reflection in the language as well. And there, if you say, I am, enjoying playing the piano, or I am, taking this glass in order to drink water. In both cases, there is a naive structure, that explains why we are doing what we're doing, and has a teleological structure in a way. And then all the explanations that are mental states, are about neuroscience or sociological, they all have to depend on the naive conception. They all have to explain it, the basic element of our actions. And the wealth of this tradition is that it can explain vices,